Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about today, well, thanks for coming first of all, but what I want to talk to you about today is slightly different to what was advertised in the abstract, which I think was something like cultural prerequisites for democracy and economic development or something. I'm going to talk to you more about kind of the process that led to us being able to say these things, which is kind of the stuff that was in my PhD thesis. Yeah, and also if I'm speaking gibberish at any point, just say, I'll clarify. So first of all, a little bit about my perspective. So yeah, as Alex said, I consider myself a computational social scientist, which is at like the data science end of the social sciences. And so what I do is I use statistics and big data, and I try and I use those things to make observations that are kind of hard to make. So I'm just noticing things, basically. So that I'm not going to be presenting any interesting quantitative explanatory models from evolution or complexity sciences or anything like that. But so my explanations are going to be more hand-wavy than that. But I like to draw upon, the findings from those fields when they're appropriate. So these are the things that I'm going to try and convince you of today during my talk, and the things I tried to convince my PhD examiners of a couple of months ago, is that I think there are two modes of cultural value change that are important when it comes to explaining human development. And they are particularly generational change, and generational change means these are like robust differences between successive generations that come about because of different conditions of socialization when these people were growing up. These are all population statements. I'm not talking about individuals at any point here. And there are period effects, which is when the opinion of a whole population changes at once, all the generations, in response often to some exogenous shock, like an economic downturn or something like that. And it's generational change that I think that is most closely linked to human development outcomes like democratization and economic development and things. And as Alex said, we used all of this work to write a paper for Science Advances that showed that secularization precedes economic development and not the other way around. So I'll tell you all about that. So first of all, what do I mean by cultural values? Because that's obviously, to some people who I'd speak to this research about, that just smacks of imperialism to them. So I'll just explain what I mean by cultural values, which is quite simple. I just mean the average attitudes, beliefs, and preferences of a population. In the case of this research, a country. And the important observation also is that these differences between different cultures or countries are stable. They really exist, basically. And, oh yes, I forgot to mention, this is the most famous illustration of this cultural value diversity that we see in the world. This is the Inglehart-Wälzel cultural map. I'll tell you more about what the axes mean in a bit. But this just illustrates that, shows that there is variation, and it's interesting, it's telling. So it's a thing, this is the thing that I want to investigate and explain. So as I said, I'm at the data science end of this profession, this field. So I need data, and the way that cultural values are measured is using multi-item surveys, which are expensive. Yeah, and they're expensive when they're administered in many different countries. And here are a few examples of other surveys that I didn't use. So there's the Eurobarometer survey, which is administered in European Union countries, but goes back a very long way, so that it has that advantage. very long way means it goes back to the 1970s or so, which is a long time for this research. And there are these other ones, the Schwartz and Hofstadter surveys, which are administered in lots of different countries, but they use what's called matched samples. So they just look at people from one profession and then compare the people from the same profession in different countries, like school teachers or something like that. I use the Ward Value Survey data. It uses representative samples for a start, so it uses like probabilistic sampling to get representative samples from all of the populations that it administers the survey to. But the thing I like most about it is that it just has the most data. It is the most comprehensive. It has these features which are nice. So 109 countries, representing 90% of the world's population, which is, yeah, just like as good as it gets, really, for this kind of stuff. 500,000 participants, lots of demographic information as well, so information on date of birth and income and all sorts of stuff. And importantly for us, it comes in 5 ways. So there are 5 editions of this survey since 1990, which means we can access the dynamics because there are countries, so countries have been measured, we have cross-sectional samples from the same country at lots of different times. So it makes comparison across time possible. And importantly, despite there being loads of questions in this survey, like 100 questions, 100 to 200 questions in total in each survey, there are 67 that appear in all of them. So again, this helps with comparison across time. 67 questions is complicated, so we want to compress this into a smaller set of more salient and interpretable factors. So this is, again, we've already met this guy, the Inglehart-Wälzer cultural map. They compress the world, so this uses the World Value Survey data I should mention. So Ronald Inglehart, the guy who made this, he like is the World Value Survey. Like he kind of started it, and he has a big influence over it. So he expresses the variation in cultural values globally using 2 dimensions. First one being survival versus self-expression values. And self-expression cultures are cultures that think things like equality are important and well-being. These are like their highest priorities. And there's traditional versus secular rational, which is a dimension that where people at the traditional end tend to be religious, favor hierarchies and things like that, and secular rational people in those countries tend to be more politically engaged and secular. But these Inglehart and Wälzer arrived at these dimensions through theory. So they already had this model in mind, and they picked out the World Value Survey questions that they thought expressed these preconceived theoretical dimensions, and then used confirmatory methods to show that they did indeed map onto these theoretical constructs that they believed existed. But this isn't going to be our approach. Our approach is going to be more data-driven. So we use an exploratory factor analysis to see what the data had to say about what interpretable factors might underlie the World Value Survey data. I'm not going to go into all the details because it was not methodologically groundbreaking. But we get 9 cultural factors. And these labels which I've given them, I won't go through them all, but they're easy to label because we selected factors based on interpretability. And by interpretability, I mean each one of these factors is highly correlated with a unique set of questions from the Ward Value Survey. So for instance, factor 1, which is secularism, is highly correlated with questions like, how important is God in your life on a scale of 1 to 10? How important is it to instill religious faith in your child on a scale of 1 to 10? And so on. And this just proves that we are capturing some cross-cultural variation. So all these squares represent a country. I haven't labeled them, but so this is, on the left-hand side, is secularism versus respect for individual rights. And the right-hand side, well-being versus trust in outgroups. And the one on the left here, secularism and respect for individual rights, shows that our factors are correlated, they're not orthogonal. So secularism is correlated with respect for individual rights. So now that we have this 9-dimensional space, we can start to talk about the dynamics and how countries move through this space is what I mean by that. Yeah, and this is where having those repeated cross-sectional measurements are going to be useful. Right, so this here is the furthest. We're standing way back and we're looking at a summary here. These are global averages. So I'm averaging every single country here. In each of our cultural factors on the y-axis there, and then on the x-axis is the average global change per decade in each of those cultural factors, taking into account all of the countries. And I think there are some factors here where you see where there is a clear global trend. So since 1990, when this data begins, countries have become less politically engaged on average and now have a greater respect for individual rights on average. But you see for lots of these factors, there isn't a clear global trend. And say that again? Oh yeah, of course. So PE, so this is political engagement, okay? And then respect for individual rights is this one here, INV. Do you want me to go through them all? Yeah? Cool. So yeah, that's a good idea because we're going to see similar plots to this in the future. So SEC is secularization. IC is institutional confidence. Norm is trust of traditional norm violators. Pro is pro-sociality. IP, this is interest in politics. WB is well-being or subjective well-being. PE, political engagement. INV, respect for individual rights. And out is trust of outgroups. Yes, and also these big error bars, these are just standard errors. So you can see that so there's a huge amount of variation there. It's heterogeneous, the direction and scale of the change. Okay. But we can dig down on these cross-sectional samples and see what's going on underneath, because the literature on this stuff says that we should expect to see 3 types of possible value change that's going on in the background. There are generational changes, which I spoke about in the introduction, and these are stable differences in attitudes between people that were born at different times because of the different socialization conditions of their childhoods. Period effects. This is when the whole population changes at once in response to maybe an exogenous shock. A good example of this is the 9/11 effect, where following 9/11, people in the United States and Western European countries too, there was a noticeable increase in confidence in the government and a notable increase in religiosity as well. And there's life cycle effects, which is when your values change throughout your life in a predictable way. And I guess the thing that we think we're noticing is people get more conservative as they get older. I think there's some literature on that. Conventional regression methods can't tease these apart for this reason. If you're going to try and tease apart period, so a regression would have to contain the time period, the birth date, and the age of a person, but they're obviously perfectly linearly dependent on each other. And so you need more information. You need some sort of constraint to add that's going to break this linear dependency. And it would be really convenient if one of these had almost no effect, which I think is the case. I don't think there is really a significant aging effect. In my PhD thesis, there's a whole bit dedicated to explaining why I think this is the case and why I don't think that the data bears it out at all. I'm not going to present all that, but I'll just show you my favorite piece of visual evidence for this. So this plot is from a 2008 paper, again by Ronald Inglehart, and it uses the Eurobarometer survey data that I mentioned earlier. So this data has only been collected in Western European countries, so like Britain, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, I forget the precise countries. And it measures post-materialist versus materialist values, which is just something that Ronald Inglehart is interested in. And what each of these lines represent is a generation, so are people born between two dates, and how that generation's cultural values changed through time. So this dotted line, for instance, is people born between 1886 and 1905, then 1906, then between 1906 and 1915, and so on. Measured from 1970 all the way up to 2006. So this is like a longitudinal study is like the only way of really getting an idea of teasing apart these effects. And so the important thing here is that, so the first thing to notice is that these differences between the generations, they persist through time. So it's noisy, but you can see that they don't overlap, so the oldest generation here never becomes way more post-materialist than the youngest generation. These generational gaps persist over time. So we're looking out for aging effects in this plot. And there's no evidence of aging effects, right? So even though the values of these generations do change as we go through time, that's obvious, that the changes that are happening, these changes, the ups and downs, they're correlated, right? They're affecting every generation all at once. And so that's a period effect, not an aging effect. So I think, actually, as a matter of fact, when I was defending my thesis the other month, they said, what is the most important figure in your thesis? And I had to say it was this one that I didn't produce. Okay, so I think aging effects are insignificant. So we can talk about period effects and generational effects as different things. So we can now start to look at how they differ in character. Right, so so a quick summary. So period effects are when the whole population moves together And the way that I've isolated period effects statistically is taking those cross-sectional samples that I showed you a few slides ago and correcting for the different generational compositions in those samples, because that's going to change through time, obviously. And then generational changes, or those stable differences between the different generations that I showed you. And I've isolated those by dividing the data into generations by decade of birth, and then averaging people born in those decades of birth over all of the available time periods. Okay, so this is the same as the plot that I showed you a few slides ago. These are the same cultural values, the cultural factors. And again, these are global averages. So on the left, these are the global average trends in terms of period effects. And here on the right are the global average effects in terms of generational changes. And so the one on the left looks a lot like the cross-sectional trends that I showed you earlier, because we'll see in a few slides that they're more or less the same thing. Not quite the same thing, though. But yeah, they're heterogeneous, and in many of the factors, there's no clear global average trend. However, generationally speaking, if you look at the differences between generations, there is a clear global profile towards values that are SCX, which is secular, norm, which is trust in traditional norm violators. People are getting happier intergenerationally. Political engagement's going up, respect for individual rights is going up, and trust in outgroups is going up. Although concerningly, pro-sociality is way down. Institutional confidence and interest in politics are also down. So how do these different modes affect value change in the short and the long term? We want to try and say something about that. Okay, so here on the y-axis, the x-axis on the left-hand side, so all these squares are different countries. And these, on the x-axis, is the period change that we've seen since 1990 in that sample. And on the right-hand side is the generational change. On the y-axis in these plots, this is what I've called modern day. This is the distribution of cultural value inequalities that we see in the world today, so which is kind of a proxy for a long-term trend. And what we see here is you can see the R values that are just above these plots. Generational change explains the distribution of cultural values that we see today much better than period change, because period change it's more variable, it tends to fluctuate more. And that's what I just said. On the bottom row, so this is an equivalent plot, but instead of the modern day distribution of countries on the y-axis here, these are the cross-sectional trends that I showed you a few slides ago. So what is the influence of these two modes of change on value change in recent times, measured in the repeated cross-sectional samples in the World Value Survey? Yeah, it's dominated by these temporary period effects. Although there is an influence of generational change, it's just that, as you can imagine, generational change is incredibly slow because it involves the death of people and the replacement of those people by younger generations. So we're talking about a 25-year time sample for the World Value Survey, so this is not long enough for it to show up significantly. So So what these cross-sectional samples represent is a very noisy way of measuring this generational change. That's what I just said. Okay, so this is the transition now to the last part of the talk. So how do these modes interact with development variables? So the things that we're interested in improving. So we want to get richer and we want to have democracy. Yeah, so how do they link up with these two variables? Okay, first of all, this is a bit of an old plot. So these are the cultural factor names under here, and some of them are different. I've changed, yeah, some of the interpretations have changed slightly. In the case, this is just religiosity instead of secularization, times by -1. But it doesn't matter here because this is just the variance explained. So the top row here, this is the variance explained in the recent trends, the recent trends that we've seen in GDP per capita. And the bottom row, this axis here represents the recent trends we've seen in democratization. Okay, and so the first column is the proportion of the variance explained by generational change, the proportion of the variance explained by the cross-sectional samples, that's the standard cross-sectional samples, and the proportion of the variance explained by the period effect time series. These are all marginal correlations. There's nothing clever going on here. But it's clear that it is the generational changes that are really linked to these improvements in human development. So the possible causal links between development and generational cultural change, because it's a bit of a weird thing to imagine how, it's not that intuitive how they might interact, so I thought I'd just say a little bit about it. So from the literature, I would say these two are pretty close to being facts, based on my reading of the literature. So cultural values are formed and crystallized during the first few decades of life. There's a lot of signal there. And generational, we've touched on this, but generational differences arise because different environments, people grow up in different environments. So development could cause changes in cultural values because a developing society will provide gradually improving environments for successive generations of children, meaning they might value different things. Or values could cause development because the change in culture, so as these people exit their formative years, enter the adult population, they change the cultural value makeup of that population, could make it more, and the new values could be more conducive to development. So this brings me to mine and Alex's paper. We wanted to kind of apply all that we learned in my thesis to the question of secularization and economic development. So, yeah, there's loads of empirical evidence that shows that religious countries tend to be poorer than secular ones. And this is from a Gallup poll. I think all of the major polling agencies have done this graph at some point. So, yeah, on the y-axis, that's religiosity. X-axis, that's income. And then all the different countries. But which one came first? This is the question that we wanted to ask, right? So, because if we look at those time series and secularism came first, then it's not plausible that economic development caused secularism, though it doesn't prove that secularism causes economic development. And there's a huge literature on this, particularly in economics, and it's, who knows, it's incredibly mixed. But a couple of the advantages, so we have some advantages, we think, over some of the studies that are currently out there. So we know that our generational time series is the correct way to look at this, because we think we've shown that cross-sectional samples, we think generational trends are the most important mode of change, and that cross-sectional samples, which are normally used, are just noisy representations of that. And plus we've got 109 countries. So we've got the newest version of the World Value Survey with the most countries. So that's another advantage. Right, so yes, we've got, oh yeah, I didn't mention. So the fact that we're using generations means that our time series has expanded. So before we only had a time series from 1990 up to the present day, but the World Value Survey, so in 1990 there were still people responding to the survey who were born in the 1900s and the 1910s, meaning that we have nearly all of the 20th century as a time series for secularization. The Madison Project provided the historical GDP per capita time series. It's an established, well-trodden path, the Madison Project. Right, so these are, so this is a few sample countries from our data. There's Great Britain, Nigeria, Chile, and Philippines. And the red line is the intergenerational trend in secularization, and the blue line is the trend in gross domestic product per capita. And this kind of suggests maybe that secularization precedes GDP, but this won't do as an explanation, as an observation. Oh, and the other thing is that we have, even though we've got a 100-year time series, we've only got 10 points, because we can only measure, to get reasonable sample sizes, we had to say that a generation equals a decade. So we only have 10-point time series, but we have 109 countries. So let's pool the data, and we'll see if we can come up with something general. So we use multi-level models to do this, which is what this lambda and gamma terms on the end mean. So what this first equation is telling us is, does historical wealth predict future secularization? And well, equation 2 is saying, does historic gross domestic product predict historical secularization, predict future gross domestic product? And it turns out the secularization, the time series of secularization precedes economic development, which, as Alex mentioned, was published in Science Advances in July. And this is the table of results. This is the finding, innocuous as it looks. In the first column there, you can see that past GDP does not predict future secularization, but past secularization does predict future GDP. And for some reason, the Times put it on their front page. But it was good. I was trolled, actually. I was trolled because of this article, but I won't share that with you. And just out of interest, what would happen if we hadn't used the generational trends? What if we had used the cross-sectional samples, as is normally done in the literature? You'd get the opposite effect. So this table at the top here, you see that past GDP predicts future secularization, yes. Although the effect dies out possibly because these period effects are temporary. Well, it doesn't die out, but it becomes, noisier. And past secularization does not predict future GDP after any amount of years, 5, 10, or 15. And this might explain why so much of the literature using studies similar to mine report the opposite effect. They're actually measuring temporary effects on secularization rather than this long-term stuff that really we should be interested in. I think I've come in under 50 minutes, just about. So thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Really fascinating. So, at least from the headline in the newspaper, it seemed like it was announcing a causal relationship.
You know what journalists are like?
Yeah. So I'm wondering what your thoughts on whether there's a causal relationship, because I can think of, there's variable problems that can temporarily act quicker, for example, on, secularization and slower onto GDP. So you'd see the time series effect, but it doesn't necessarily. Oh
no, definitely not.
Okay.
Well, as a matter of fact, so there's loads of other stuff in the paper that I didn't mention here, and actually, we added a control for one of our other cultural factors, which was respect for individual rights, because as I showed on that slide, they're very well correlated, and actually that is a far better explanation for future economic development, and this is because there are secular countries out there that the correlation between secularization and economic development isn't perfect. There are lots of rich religious countries, so like the USA, for instance. Well, they're not really religious by global standards, but they're very religious considering how wealthy they are. And also the Catholic countries of Europe, like Ireland and Italy, are richer. They're more religious than you might think. And the other way as well, so the countries like China and Russia are poorer than the secularism, how secular they are. Yeah.
Can you see, it might not be clear what a rich data set you now have. You've taken 5 waves of the World Values Survey and created 9 factors that were data-driven and not driven by your preconceptions about how the data look. And now you have, for 109 countries, you have a time series that goes back 1 century for each one of those countries on each one of those 9 different cultural values. Mm-hmm. So it seems now you have kind of a gold mine for exploring different causal drivers or correlations with those different cultural factors. What kinds of things are you thinking of doing as you go forward?
Well, I'm open to collaborations on that front. The thing that I'm working on now with you is we're looking at time series of yeah, so we're working on the relationship between values and democratization, and values and the emergence of widespread education. But I don't know. I mean, if you've got a theory, then.
Are you also looking at how clusters of countries move in correlated directions? To any extent, because the old Engelhardt, map had the
yeah. Yeah, so he describes those as clusters, but as far as I can tell, he's just drawn lines around countries. So there was some stuff in my PhD thesis about this where I clustered countries based on trends and average locations. But so yeah, that's something. It's kind of underdeveloped, I guess, and my PhD examiners didn't like it, so I decided not to mention it.
I have kind of a related question. So your first part, so you basically merged all kind of Western European countries together, in a sense.
Merged?
Well, I mean, the data that you showed, that was kind of, no, not for individual countries, like the changes in norms and values. But there are data for individual countries.
Oh, yeah.
And you can correlate the changes with some events. And then also related to that map that you showed, like some people who study cultural evolution, they kind of claim that certain things that we can observe now, for example, like in the map of Western Europe, can be traced back to whatever was happening 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Like there are very certain norms and values, they have been extremely stable, and they affect political developments, economic developments, stuff like that. So can you comment on this?
I think that's definitely plausible, and it's something that I'm reading and writing about at the moment for our next paper, and it's that. So there does seem to be an influence of. So for instance, there are differences between different linguistic groups, and differences between different religious groups, and yeah, it does beg for an explanation why that would be, and they're not obviously inheriting the values from their ancestors thousands of years ago, but I think it's more that so values or the means of economic development, like the Industrial Revolution, would emerge in one place, and then the spread of this information is impeded by the stable cultural features that you're talking about. So things like language barriers and religious barriers will prevent the spread of the means of economic development, or the spread of secularism, if you like. And I think that's why you see culturally similar countries clustering together.
Geographic environment, right?
Yeah.
So, and there are people who claim that, I know if you've seen the book that just came out by Michelle Gelfand on social
Not read it yet, no.
On social norms.
Yeah.
So basically that's what she uses, like geography and environment has the strongest effect on norms.
It's on my list. Is she coming here? Did I see that?
Yeah.
How exciting.
So it's certainly a common observation that in many cultures, including our own, there's a split between the rural and urban populations. Have you incorporated that in any of your models yet? Are the data available that you can tell
I
population size of the communities where the people are from?
I haven't done that. I've just looked at country averages, but like I said, I mean there's a wealth of demographic information in the World Value Survey. I'm sure you could do something like that, absolutely. But I haven't. But yeah, I mean, you would expect a huge amount of variation based on particularly the urban versus rural variable, definitely.
About 25 years ago, Samuel Huntington wrote a book called Clash of Civilizations, in which he partitioned the world based primarily on what he thought were cultural separations between societies.
Yeah.
And they tended to be based primarily on religion, but to some extent national histories. What it looks like you're doing is actually developing another way in which you could partition human society, countries around the world, and it would be interesting to see how your partitioning compared with what he came up with, because for better or for worse, his thesis has driven an awful lot of thinking in terms of national and international relations.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've read that book, and I wrote about it in my thesis. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, so because like I said, I like to come at it from a data-driven perspective, whereas he was more of an ideas guy. And yeah, the clusters do emerge in the way, roughly the way that he said.
But differently too. That's what's interesting. I think
Yeah.
about your study, the fact that he said in terms of the religious, the differences between the degree of secularization can vary. So that's what I think is interesting, because it could show basically nation states because the hunting thesis has been very influential, and I'm not sure it's completely accurate.
Yeah, based on the stats that I've done, not completely right now. Yeah.
Thanks. I have a question, and I'll try to make it as simple as possible. And the initial part of the question is essentially, where are you coming from, theoretically speaking? So I'm a sociologist. Right? At some point, you recognize the contributions of economists. Sociologists have been treading on this turf too, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious what your theoretical foundations are, because the sociological connections to this are very apparent. And it's quite interesting how your research actually confirms the frames that were introduced by several of the founders of sociology. So we can even go back further with Marx. So the frame of generational shifts is all there, of course.
Oh yeah.
From the early to the middle to the late Marx, etc. If we expand that beyond Marx, then this is extremely compatible and very interesting. How you basically operationalize, so to speak, the effects, in a sense, of alienation, which in Marx, of course, was alienation to commodity fetishism, and then you continue it beyond. And the other thing that fits really well with this cover page is Max Weber, of course. According to whom what produces wealth initially was not secularization as such, but the replacement of one religion with another religion. And of course, I'm talking about the Protestant ethic. And of course, the Protestant ethic thesis does not explain change now. This is sort of in the sense, and that's what my question is getting at, the tension between anthropology and sociology. So essentially, in terms of how I explain to students the difference between the two disciplines, which they usually ask about early on in the semester. And I teach theory, so this is the old stuff, 1800s, and so forth. And so oftentimes the question is, what's the difference between sociology and anthropology? And the pat answer I give usually is that anthropology is interested in societies as expressions of human characteristics. Whereas sociology is interested in society as a consequence of the transformations that occurred in the late 1700s. I usually use 1776 as the marker, so as a consequence of industrialization and the spread of market economies, etc. And so the question I have is really basically, how does your framework relate to the sociological framework? If we go back to the beginnings, and how can yours inform sociology, and to the extent to which you're familiar with sociology, how can sociology inform your framing?
Well, I don't have any training in social science really. So, as Alex said, my undergraduate was in engineering, and then I've gone into this complexity science program. I've gone into social science through the back door, basically, and I'm finding out about sociology and anthropology. I'm in an anthropology department, but I don't have any training in anthropology. So I'm finding out about these interesting theories, like you mentioned Weber. And as a matter of fact, how we framed the Science Advances paper was as a kind of Weber versus Durkheim dichotomy, right? Because it was Durkheim's functionalist theory. So his about his functionalist view of religion, right? So he says that religion serves functions, and secularization is happening because other things are serving those functions now, and so that's an empirically testable idea, right? So you would expect development to happen first in a context like that, whereas Weber says no, it's religious change that happens first, and then you get development. So in a sense, we framed our paper as confirming Weber's hypothesis and proving Durkheim wrong.